They called him the underworld's Iron Man, a figure who moved through decades with the same quiet intensity as a shadow that refuses to fade. For more than a century, Sonny Franzese lived in the world of the mafia, outlasting his rivals, his friends, and even the prosecutors who tried to bring him down. He was there in the golden days of the American mob, when the five families ruled New York streets, and he was still there when much of that power had crumbled, still sharp, still remembered. His story is one of charm, violence, resilience, and survival. Tonight, we'll follow the arc of a man who saw the mafia at its height and lived long enough to watch it decline, a man whose name carried weight in backrooms and courtrooms alike. This is the life of John Sonny Franzese. He was born in 1917 in Naples, Italy, and came to the United States as a child. The Franzese family settled in Brooklyn, a place teeming with immigrants who carried old traditions and built new ones. The streets were alive with corner shops, parish bells, and whispers of opportunity, both honest and criminal. Young Sonny grew up in a world where respect mattered more than money, and reputation was currency you never spent carelessly. He absorbed those lessons early, carrying himself with the kind of quiet confidence that made older boys notice him. By his teenage years, the Great Depression was squeezing families across the city. Jobs were scarce, tempers short, and survival often meant bending rules. Sonny discovered that he had both the charm to win friends and the toughness to keep them. He played baseball with a local team, danced with neighborhood girls at parish socials, and carried himself like someone destined for more. At the same time, he drifted into the orbit of men who wore sharp suits and seemed to answer to no one. They ran gambling games, controlled clubs, and spoke with an authority that made policemen hesitate. To a young man with ambition, it was magnetic. The Colombo crime family, then still known under different leadership, began noticing Sonny. He wasn't just another street kid chasing quick money. He had poise, discipline, and an ability to listen. Those qualities mattered more than fists in the long run. By the 1940s, while many men his age were fighting overseas in World War II, Sonny was building a reputation at home. He registered for the draft but was declared unfit for service because of a supposed heart murmur, a detail that would later become controversial. Whether by luck or maneuvering, he stayed in New York while others went abroad, and that allowed him to deepen his ties to the mob. His rise was steady. He started with small rackets, gambling, loan sharking, nightclub management, and proved himself trustworthy with money. That trust is what opened doors. In the mafia, anyone could earn $1, but not everyone could be trusted to deliver it to the right hands. Sonny's reliability, combined with his charm, won him favor with higher-ups. He learned to move between worlds, comfortable in smoky backrooms with gangsters and just as comfortable smiling across a table from legitimate businessmen. That duality became his signature. By the 1950s, Sonny Franzese was a force. He was known in clubs across Manhattan, the kind of man who could walk into the Copacabana and have a table waiting. He brushed shoulders with celebrities, athletes, and politicians, blending the worlds of crime and glamour. Behind the polished exterior, though, he was ruthless when needed. Stories circulated, never confirmed, always whispered, about the lengths he went to enforce discipline. Whether true or exaggerated, those stories fueled his reputation. In a life where fear and respect often walked hand in hand, Sonny commanded both. Unlike some mobsters who lived loudly, throwing money and drawing headlines, Sonny cultivated an image of elegance. He dressed immaculately, spoke softly, and carried himself with dignity. That didn't mean he was soft. Far from it. But he understood that power wasn't just about intimidation. It was about presence. People listened when he entered a room not because he shouted, but because he didn't need to. His money came from a wide range of ventures. He had interests in nightclubs, jukebox routes, and union deals. He was connected to bank robberies and extortion schemes, though rarely caught red-handed. Law enforcement eyed him constantly, but he seemed to slip through their grasp time and again. Detectives grew frustrated knowing he was involved but unable to pin anything solid on him. Each time he walked free, his legend grew. He became, in the eyes of many, untouchable. But Sonny's world wasn't just glamour and whispered respect. It was also a battlefield. Rivalries between families, internal disputes, and the constant pressure from law enforcement meant danger was never far. He had to navigate carefully, choosing allies wisely, avoiding unnecessary risks. He wasn't reckless like some, and that caution helped him survive. Still, survival required more than caution. It required resilience, and Sonny had that in abundance. By the late 1950s, his name carried weight across all of New York. He was close to Joseph Colombo, whose rise would eventually rename the family, and he played a role in shaping its direction. Sonny had become more than a soldier. He was a leader, someone younger men looked to for guidance. He wasn't the loudest voice, but he was one of the most respected. And yet, the higher you rise, the more eyes follow you. Law enforcement grew more determined, rival families more watchful, and betrayal more likely. Sonny Franzese had built a life of influence and wealth, but he was about to discover that power in the mafia was always balanced on a knife's edge. By the dawn of the 1960s, Sonny Franzese was more than just a name whispered in bars and backrooms. He was a presence that carried across the entire city. He had carved out a life where business overlapped with nightlife, where power could be exercised with either a handshake or a glare. In a world filled with brash voices and hot tempers, Sonny's quiet style made him stand apart. He wasn't the type to slam fists on tables or bark orders. He let his reputation do the talking, and that reputation had grown into something formidable. The nightclub scene was his kingdom. Manhattan after dark belonged to men like Sonny, who blended crime and glamour until the lines blurred. He was seen at the Copacabana, the Latin Quarter, and other hotspots where entertainers, athletes, and politicians rubbed shoulders with mobsters. For celebrities, having Sonny's approval meant security, connections, and the guarantee that nothing would go wrong in their clubs. For Sonny, it meant influence that stretched beyond the street. He was a man who could sit in a booth with a famous singer one night and oversee a loan collection the next morning without missing a step. Behind the bright lights and champagne, his rackets kept money flowing. Loan sharking was steady, with debts collected through quiet persuasion or, when necessary, harder measures. Gambling dens thrived under his protection, card games running until dawn with envelopes passed discreetly into trusted hands. He also had stakes in jukebox routes, a surprisingly lucrative business at the time, and his control over union interests gave him leverage in construction and entertainment alike. These were not small hustles. They were pillars of an empire that generated real wealth, wealth that filtered upward into the Colombo family's coffers. By now, Joseph Colombo had risen to head the family, and Sonny was firmly in his circle. He was seen as one of the family's most polished and dependable figures. He didn't just enforce rules, he embodied them. Younger men looked to him as a model of how to carry themselves: sharp suits, steady voice, and a demeanor that radiated confidence without carelessness. For many, Sonny represented the old-school style of mobster, the kind who understood both business and discipline. But law enforcement was watching. The FBI, which had long downplayed the mafia's existence, was now under pressure to prove otherwise. Wiretaps, surveillance, and informants became their weapons, and men like Sonny were prime targets. Agents followed him through the city, photographing him entering clubs, meeting with associates, or slipping into neighborhood restaurants. Each picture was logged, each movement analyzed. For years, though, they struggled to catch him in anything concrete. Sonny had a way of avoiding incriminating words, of speaking in code or not speaking at all. He was careful, and that caution frustrated investigators to no end. Still, whispers about his ruthlessness persisted. Tales circulated about how he handled betrayal, how he enforced debts, how he reminded men of their obligations. These stories were never confirmed, but in the mafia, perception mattered as much as reality. The more frightening the stories, the less likely anyone was to test him. Whether Sonny cultivated those rumors or not, they served him well. People stepped lightly around him, respecting both the man and the myth. Yet Sonny wasn't all menace. He had a charm that made him welcome in places where other mobsters weren't. He could sit with businessmen and talk investments, laugh with entertainers about show business, or chat with politicians without making them nervous. He understood that power wasn't just about fear, it was about relationships. By weaving himself into legitimate society, he gained insulation. He wasn't just another gangster hiding in smoky backrooms. He was a figure who seemed to belong everywhere, from corner bars to Broadway openings. The 1960s also brought turmoil inside the mafia itself. The Commission, which oversaw the five families, was constantly balancing rivalries, profits, and shifting alliances. When Joseph Colombo began asserting himself publicly, most notably by launching the Italian-American Civil Rights League, many old-school bosses bristled. They preferred shadows to headlines. Sonny, ever the survivor, navigated carefully. He supported his boss while keeping himself at a safe distance from the spotlight. He knew that too much attention could be as dangerous as too little, but distance couldn't save him from scrutiny forever. In 1966, Sonny faced a major blow. He was indicted on charges connected to bank robberies. Prosecutors accused him of being involved in a series of heists across Long Island and beyond. The evidence was murky, built largely on testimony and suspicion, but the government saw him as a prize. Convicting Sonny Franzese would be proof that no gangster was untouchable. The trial was dramatic, filled with witnesses who whispered about his alleged role and prosecutors who painted him as a mastermind. Sonny denied it all, calmly maintaining his innocence. He carried himself in court with the same composure he showed in clubs, wearing tailored suits and meeting accusations with steady eyes. The jury, however, was swayed. He was convicted and sentenced to 50 years. For a man in his late 40s, it sounded like a death sentence. Prison, though, did not break Sonny Franzese. Behind bars, he carried himself as he always had, dignified, disciplined, respected. Other inmates looked up to him, drawn by the same charisma that had defined his life on the outside. Guards noted his composure, the way he never lost control, never allowed himself to be diminished. He became, even in confinement, a symbol of endurance. Outside, his name remained powerful. The Colombo family continued its business, but the absence of a figure like Sonny was felt. He had been both a steady hand and a bridge between worlds, and without him, cracks began to show. Yet Sonny's legend only grew. To many, he became proof of the government's determination to break the mafia. To others, he was the ultimate example of resilience, a man who could be locked away but never erased. The 1960s had transformed Sonny from a rising power into a convicted figure, but even in prison, he never faded. His story was far from over. Decades still lay ahead, and with them would come both hardship and remarkable survival. For Sonny Franzese, time itself seemed to bend, and each chapter only deepened the legend of the underworld's Iron Man. Prison was never meant to be a place where men like Sonny Franzese thrived, yet he adapted to it with the same calm precision that had defined his life on the streets. The year was 1967 when he entered the federal system, and by then he carried a name that echoed far beyond New York. Guards and inmates alike knew who he was. For some, that reputation sparked fear. For others, it sparked admiration. Sonny understood this dynamic instantly and moved through the cell blocks like a man who had always belonged to no one and nothing but his own discipline. He carried himself with dignity. He dressed as neatly as prison clothing allowed, kept himself fit, and spoke with the same steady voice that once charmed celebrities in nightclubs. Men noticed that he never raised his voice, never begged for favors, never carried himself like he was broken. Respect followed him, just as it had outside. Younger inmates, some with ties to street gangs, watched closely. They saw that he had survived indictment, trial, and conviction, and he still radiated the same power. To them, he was a living example of endurance. Life inside had its challenges. The food was poor, the routines dull, and the endless sameness of days could grind down even the toughest spirit. Yet Sonny turned the monotony into a kind of training. He read, he worked out, he wrote letters, and he learned how to maintain his mind as sharply as his body. When men came to him with problems, he offered advice the way he once had to younger associates in Brooklyn. He reminded them that survival depended on patience, and that weakness was a luxury none could afford. Still, time moved slowly. Months stretched into years, and years into decades. Outside, the world was changing. The mafia was under greater pressure than ever, with the FBI devoting new resources to wiretaps, informants, and undercover operations. The Colombo family, once steady, was shaken by internal strife. Leadership disputes turned bloody, and the family's stability cracked. From inside, Sonny heard the news through newspapers and visits, each headline reminding him that the world he had once helped shape was shifting in dangerous ways. For Sonny, the prison years were not just about survival, they were about patience. He believed, deep down, that he would not spend the rest of his life behind bars. He told friends and family that he would outlast his sentence, that he would one day walk free. Many doubted it. 50 years was a long stretch, and few men returned from such terms with their spirit intact. But Sonny carried an almost unshakable confidence. He had been underestimated before, and he intended to prove people wrong again. During the 1970s, his influence inside prison grew. Even without money to flash or suits to wear, he commanded respect through presence. Inmates learned quickly that Sonny was not a man to be trifled with, yet he rarely had to prove it. His reputation, carefully built over decades, followed him like a shield. Guards, too, while keeping him under watch, acknowledged that he was different from the average inmate. They noted his courtesy, his composure, and his ability to keep situations calm when tensions flared. Outside, younger mobsters began invoking his name as legend. For them, Sonny was the embodiment of the old-school gangster, the man who never bent, never broke, never betrayed. Even those who had never met him spoke of him as if they had. His absence became a presence of its own. He was the figure looming in stories told across bars and restaurants, a reminder of a time when mobsters carried themselves with class as well as fear. But prison was not without personal cost. His family felt the weight of his absence. Children grew older, marriages strained, and Sonny could only watch from afar. Letters and visits bridged the gap, but they could not erase the distance. For a man who had once been at the center of every room, confinement was its own kind of torture, yet he never showed despair. To those who saw him, Sonny remained composed, even smiling. He would not allow anyone to think he had been broken. The years dragged on, but small victories came. Appeals chipped away at his sentence. Lawyers argued about evidence, about fairness, about whether the government had built its case more on reputation than on fact. Slowly, bit by bit, time worked in his favor. He was released on parole at intervals, only to be sent back when conditions were said to have been violated. Each return to prison tested him, but each time he walked back in, he carried himself with the same dignity. The system could confine him, but it could not diminish him. By the early 1980s, when he was briefly free, Sonny returned to a city transformed. Nightclubs had changed, the old glamour dimmed, and new crews with different styles ran the streets. Yet his presence still carried weight. Men greeted him with respect, even reverence. He had survived when many of his peers had fallen to indictments, assassinations, or betrayals. To see Sonny walking free was to see a living relic of a vanished era. Still, freedom was always temporary. Parole violations, whether real or exaggerated, pulled him back behind bars. Each time he adjusted with the same resilience. By now it was clear. Sonny Franzese was not just a gangster. He was a survivor, a man whose endurance defied the odds. The years that broke others became chapters in his legend. He was living proof that the underworld's Iron Man could not be bent by the weight of time. The 1970s faded into the 1980s, and the mafia itself changed. Informants rose in number, trials grew larger, and bosses who once seemed invincible faced life sentences. The old ways eroded under pressure. Yet through it all, Sonny Franzese remained. Locked up, released, locked up again. His story was one of persistence. Each time the government thought it had buried him, he resurfaced. Each time doubters thought he had faded, his name came back stronger. Inside prison walls, he spoke often of the future. He told those around him that he would live to see freedom again, that he would not die in confinement. It sounded like bravado, but those who knew him began to believe it. There was something about Sonny's will, something unyielding, that made people think he might just outlast everyone. And as the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, Sonny Franzese proved them right. He was still alive, still sharp, still remembered. A man born in 1917 who had lived through the Depression, the golden age of the mafia, and the government's war against organized crime, was still standing. For Sonny, the story was far from over. His greatest test was still to come: how to remain relevant in a world where the mafia itself was unraveling. By the time the 1990s arrived, the world Sonny Franzese had once ruled over was nearly unrecognizable. The mafia was under siege in ways it had never been before. Federal prosecutors armed with racketeering laws cut deep into the five families, and wiretaps picked up conversations that bosses once thought were safe. Informants, once rare, became almost common. The code of silence that had protected men for decades was cracking, and with every trial another wave of secrets spilled into the open. Sonny had outlasted many of his peers, but he could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. The Colombo family, once steady, had plunged into a bitter war between rival factions. It was a violent, chaotic period where allegiances shifted quickly and the streets filled with blood. Sonny was older now, yet his reputation still carried weight. He was seen as a man from an earlier era, a reminder of the time when mobsters dressed sharp, carried themselves with discipline, and respected the structure. Younger men who barely remembered the golden days looked at him with awe, as though standing in the presence of living history. Even so, respect could not shield him from the changing nature of the life. Parole violations continued to haunt him, sending him back and forth to prison. Each time he returned, he carried himself the same way, upright, calm, dignified. But inside he must have wondered how much longer he could keep surviving the endless cycle. Most men half his age had either died or turned government witness. Sonny, born in 1917, was pushing into his 70s and still refusing to bend. Outside, the mafia faced new challenges. Drugs had flooded the streets, bringing both money and chaos. Law enforcement cracked down harder, using undercover agents and expanded surveillance. The public, once charmed by the glamour of mobsters in suits, now saw the violence and corruption more clearly than ever. For the younger generation of wise guys, the old rules seemed less sacred. Ambition was sharper, patience shorter, and loyalty thinner. For Sonny, who had built his life on discipline, it must have been both frustrating and saddening to watch. Still, he remained a figure of authority. When he walked into a room, conversations slowed. His voice carried weight, not because it was loud, but because it was steady. Even the younger faction leaders understood that Sonny's presence was not something to take lightly. He embodied the history of their world, and even in his later years that history commanded attention. Yet betrayal would come from the place he least expected, his own family. His son, Michael Franzese, had risen to prominence within the Colombo family during the 1980s. Michael was sharp, ambitious, and media savvy, a man who made headlines for his lucrative gasoline tax scam and for his glamorous lifestyle. For a while, he seemed poised to become one of the most powerful figures in organized crime. But when Michael faced federal charges and eventually walked away from the mafia, the rupture between father and son widened. Sonny, the old-school loyalist who believed in silence and survival through obedience to the code, struggled to reconcile with a son who had chosen a different path. Even more painful was another betrayal. One of his other sons, John Franzese Jr., secretly became an FBI informant. In the 2000s, long after Sonny had already lived a lifetime in the shadows, His son wore a wire against him. The recordings captured Sonny speaking about old crimes, about how things had been done in the past. Prosecutors later used those tapes to bring new charges against him. For Sonny, it was the deepest cut imaginable. Not law enforcement, not rivals, but blood betraying blood. The old rules had once promised that family was sacred. Now even that seemed fragile. When the trial came, Sonny was already in his 90s. Most men his age were enjoying quiet retirements. Yet here he was, sitting in a courtroom, accused once again of crimes tied to extortion and loan sharking. The prosecutors painted him as an unrepentant gangster who had spent a lifetime profiting from others' misery. His defense pointed to his age, his frailty, his long years behind bars. But age did not matter to the system. He was convicted again and sentenced to prison. For most, it would have been a final chapter. For Sonny, it was another test of endurance. Inside, he adjusted as he always had. Other inmates, some young enough to be his grandchildren, marveled at the sight of a man born before World War II walking the tier with the same calm stride. Guards treated him with a mix of caution and respect. Reporters who caught glimpses of him during hearings described a man who still carried himself with dignity despite the decades of confinement. His legend grew even larger. Not only had he survived the mafia's most violent years, he had survived into an age where he seemed indestructible. The years rolled on, and finally, in 2017, the impossible happened. Sonny Franzese, at 100 years old, walked out of prison. Cameras caught the moment. Reporters scribbled headlines, and the public marveled. He had been born in an era of horse-drawn carriages, had risen to power in the mafia's golden years, and had lived to see smartphones and social media dominate the world. No mobster in history had endured as long as he had. For many, his release symbolized the end of an era. In his final years, Sonny lived quietly with family, his days of influence long past, but his name never forgotten. Journalists sought interviews, filmmakers wanted his story, and younger generations whispered about the legend of the man who never broke, never cooperated, and never truly faded. He had lived through the Depression, the golden age of the mafia, the government's relentless war on organized crime and betrayal from within his own family. Through it all, he never stopped being Sonny Franzese. In February 2020, he passed away at 103 years old. His death marked the closing of a chapter that stretched nearly a century. He had been part of the mafia's rise, its peak, and its decline. He had survived prison, trials, betrayals, and old age itself. Few men in history had carried a story as long, as complex, or as unforgettable. Sonny Franzese's life remains one of the most remarkable tales in organized crime. He was both feared and admired, ruthless and charming, a man of contradictions who embodied the glamour and brutality of the mafia. More than anything, he was a survivor, outlasting everyone who thought they had seen the end of him. His name, etched into history, will always carry the weight of legend. Sonny Franzese's release from prison at the age of 100 stunned the public and reminded everyone that he was not just another mobster lost to time. He had become a living relic, a bridge between the smoky nightclubs of the 1950s and the digital age of the 21st century. When reporters gathered outside to capture the frail yet sharp figure walking free, they understood they were witnessing something rare. Few men had lived that long. Fewer still had endured so much, and none had carried the name of the mafia so deep into modern memory. Freedom at that age did not mean a return to rackets or the business of power. Instead, it meant reflection. Sonny spent his final years surrounded by family, though not without the shadows of betrayal that had defined his later life. The recordings from his son, the public testimony, the courtroom betrayals, all of it still lingered. Yet even after such wounds, Sonny carried himself without complaint. He never spoke against his son in public, never gave interviews filled with anger. Instead, he remained composed, as though he had accepted that betrayal, like prison and trials, was simply another part of the world he had chosen long ago. What struck many who met him in those final years was his clarity. Even past a century, his mind remained sharp. He remembered names, dates, stories, and the codes of conduct that had governed his life. Visitors who expected to find a broken old man instead found someone who still radiated presence. He was quiet, yes, but his silence carried weight. He could tell a story about New York in the 1940s with such detail that listeners felt transported. He could recall encounters with entertainers and politicians who had long since faded into history. Talking to Sonny was like opening a window into a world that no longer existed. At the same time, his very survival raised questions about what it meant to endure. Most of his contemporaries had been killed, imprisoned for life, or had turned government witness. Sonny had done none of those things. He had lived through more prison sentences than most could imagine, but he had also lived long enough to walk free. To many, younger men still in the life, his example was complicated. Was he proof that loyalty to the code brought longevity? Or proof that survival demanded more than loyalty, that it demanded resilience beyond ordinary limits? The media, always fascinated by his story, framed him as the last of the old-school gangsters. He had been there in the golden age of the mafia, when the five families controlled the city with near-total power. He had dined at the best tables, managed clubs where celebrities performed, and walked through New York like a man who owned the sidewalks. He had also been there when it all came crashing down, when RICO indictments shattered the structure, when sons betrayed fathers, when entire crews dissolved. Through it all, Sonny had remained, never speaking to the government, never abandoning the code. To journalists, that made him both admirable and tragic, a man who clung to an era that no longer existed. Yet Sonny did not live in the past. Even at 100, he adjusted to the present. He used modern phones, kept up with news, and commented on current events with the same sharpness he had once reserved for underworld politics. He had seen prohibition, wars, civil rights marches, disco, the crack epidemic, and the rise of the internet. Few men could say they had witnessed so many shifts, yet he spoke of them not with bitterness, but with the perspective of someone who had long ago accepted that the world changes whether you like it or not. Those close to him often remarked on his discipline. Even as a centenarian, he maintained routines. He rose at set times, ate carefully, and never allowed himself to slip into sloppiness. It was that same discipline, they believed, that had carried him through decades of confinement and preserved him into extreme old age. To Sonny, control was survival, and survival had been his greatest talent. Public fascination with him only deepened. Documentaries, books, and interviews all sought to capture his essence. Some painted him as ruthless, others as elegant, some as both. But everyone agreed on one thing: there would never be another like him. The world that had produced Sonny Franzese was gone. The mafia of his youth, with its codes, ceremonies, and traditions, had been replaced by a smaller, weaker version. The streets no longer whispered with the same fear. The nightclubs no longer had the same glamour. Without that world, there could be no second Sonny. For the mafia itself, his death would mark a symbolic end. He was the last direct link to a period when the organization controlled unions, construction, and entertainment at levels so deep that even mayors and senators feared them. Younger men still carried the names of the families, but their power was diminished. Sonny had lived long enough to see the rise, the peak, and the collapse of everything he once represented. That arc, spanning more than a century, made his life more than just a mob story. It made it a story of America itself, of immigration, ambition, crime, glamour, survival, and decline. When Sonny finally passed in February 2020 at 103 years old, obituaries across the world carried his name. They called him the oldest living mobster, the last of the old school, the underworld's Iron Man. They noted that he had lived longer than almost anyone else in his world, that he had outlasted his enemies, his rivals, even his prosecutors. His funeral, though modest, drew both family and those who remembered what his name had meant. To some, he was a legend, to others a villain, to many a mystery, but to all, he was unforgettable. In the end, Sonny Franzese's story is not simply about crime. It is about survival. It is about how one man endured a century of change, a century of danger, a century of temptation to break, and never allowed himself to surrender. He was born in an era when respect meant everything, and he died in an era when that respect had become memory. Yet in that memory, his name lives on, etched into the long, complicated history of America's underworld. When Sonny Franzese walked free at 100 years old, the story of his life became larger than ever, and in those last few years he entered a stage few mobsters ever reached. He became a figure of folklore while still alive. Newspapers marveled that he was breathing history, a man who had sat in the smoky nightclubs of the 1940s, shaken hands with entertainers and athletes in their prime, and yet was still around to watch the world carry tiny computers in their pockets. Reporters described him as sharp-eyed, neatly dressed and unbroken, even though he moved slowly with age. It seemed impossible that one man could have spanned so many eras. In quiet moments, Sonny would sit with his family, recounting stories from his youth. He spoke of the Brooklyn streets where boys played stickball, of the music that spilled from corner bars, of the first times he realized how much influence certain men carried. He remembered his nights at the Copacabana, the suits cut by tailors who understood style as armor, the swirl of jazz and swing when the city's nights seemed endless. He told these stories with detail that made his listeners feel they had stepped into another world, one that had vanished long before they were born. At the same time, Sonny's name carried a darker weight. He had lived by rules that demanded silence and loyalty, and those rules had cost him years behind bars. His own children had struggled under the shadow of his reputation, some choosing to embrace the life, and others to run from it. The betrayal of being recorded by his son was a wound he never showed openly, but those who knew him sensed the pain. Yet Sonny never lashed out publicly, never broke the silence. To the very end, he lived by the same code, even when it cost him most. For younger generations, his story was both fascinating and confusing. On one hand, he embodied loyalty. He never cooperated, never testified, never betrayed. On the other, his life was marked by violence, extortion, and fear, things that in modern times seemed stripped of the glamour the movies once painted. To them, Sonny was both an icon of discipline and a cautionary tale. They saw the charisma, the sharp clothes, the longevity, but they also saw the prison sentences, the betrayals, and the loneliness that comes with outliving almost everyone. In the years after his release, interviews with him became precious glimpses into a past no one else could describe. He spoke softly, never bragging, often smiling at questions, sometimes answering with a shake of his head that said more than words. When asked why he thought he had lived so long, he would joke that he stayed away from excess and kept moving. But those who listened closely understood it wasn't just health. It was discipline. Sonny had trained his body and mind to endure, and endurance had been his greatest ally. He became a symbol not only of the mafia's past, but of survival itself. Journalists wrote that he was proof of how far resilience could take a man. Criminal historians noted that while most of his contemporaries had died violent deaths or faded away in obscurity, Sonny had kept his name alive until the very end. To the public, he was a paradox, a man who represented one of the most feared organizations in America, yet who also seemed charming, dignified, and almost noble in his refusal to betray the code. At family gatherings in those years, he still carried himself with presence. He might have been small and fragile in frame, but when he entered a room, people straightened. They could feel his history, the weight of a man who had lived through nearly every chapter of the mafia's American story. Children and grandchildren would listen to him, not always understanding the depth of his words, but sensing that they were in the presence of something larger than life. When Sonny passed away in 2020 at 103, the tributes poured in. Newspapers across the world wrote about him. They called him the oldest living gangster, the last true link to the golden age of organized crime. They noted his loyalty, his betrayals, his resilience, and his longevity. They described him as elegant, feared, admired, and stubbornly unbreakable. For many, his death marked the closing of the last door to an era that had defined New York for half a century. In his absence, his legend only grew. Authors revisited his story, podcasts dissected his trials, and documentaries replayed his interviews. To some, he was an example of how crime destroys lives. To others, he was proof of how strength and discipline can carry a man farther than anyone expects. His life became more than a mob tale. It became a meditation on endurance, on how one man could carry secrets for a century and never bend, even as the world bent around him. What remains of Sonny Franzese is not just the record of his crimes or his trials, but the memory of his presence. He was a man who survived long enough to become myth, who outlasted enemies, rivals, and even the system that tried to bury him. He began as a boy in Brooklyn with nothing, rose into the upper ranks of the mafia, endured the full weight of the government's pursuit, and walked free at 100. His final years turned him into a symbol of resilience not only for mob history, but for anyone who wonders how much a person can endure. Sonny Franzese's story, told and retold, is about more than crime. It is about a man who lived through a century of change, who wore discipline like a second skin, who embodied both the glamour and the brutality of the underworld. His life stretched from horse-drawn carriages to smartphones, from smoky clubs to streaming documentaries. And through it all, he remained himself, steady, proud, unbroken, and unforgettable. The years after Sonny Franzese's passing saw his story move from whispered legend to cultural touchstone. He was no longer just a name in FBI files or mafia histories. He became a figure dissected in documentaries, podcasts, and books. Scholars debated his role in the larger history of organized crime. Reporters revisited his trials, and storytellers cast him as the embodiment of an era that had vanished. For many, Sonny became a way to understand the arc of the American mafia itself, from its rise among immigrants seeking power and respect, through its dominance of unions and nightclubs, to its slow decline under relentless law enforcement pressure. Yet the fascination with Sonny was not only about his crimes, it was about his survival. People marveled at how he had lived through a century of upheaval without ever betraying the code he had embraced as a young man. While countless others broke, turned government witness, or vanished in disgrace, Sonny endured. That endurance made him not just a gangster, but a symbol of discipline, of sheer willpower. For a society obsessed with longevity and resilience, his story carried lessons beyond the underworld. Journalists often highlighted the contradictions. Here was a man accused of ruthlessness, a man tied to extortion, loan sharking, and worse. Yet he carried himself with elegance and charm. He could sit with a priest and speak gently, then walk into a nightclub and command fear without raising his voice. He loved his family deeply, yet was betrayed by his own blood. He preached loyalty, yet his life demonstrated how loyalty can both preserve and destroy. In those contradictions lay the heart of his legend, a complexity that kept his story alive long after the last of his peers were forgotten. The mafia itself, though a shadow of what it had once been, still invoked his name. Younger members of the five families spoke of him as a reminder of what the old world demanded. They told stories about how he never cooperated, never gave in, never allowed weakness to be seen. In a time when the code of silence had all but collapsed, Sonny was held up as proof that it was once real, once unbreakable. His life became both inspiration and warning. Inspiration for his discipline, warning for the endless years he spent behind bars. Culturally, his story reached far beyond New York. Films and shows about organized crime began to reference him, some directly, others through characters modeled on his elegance and endurance. True crime podcasts devoted entire seasons to his life, weaving together interviews, FBI files, and the haunting tapes recorded by his son. Each retelling painted him a little differently, sometimes as a villain, sometimes as a survivor, sometimes as both. But in every telling, the core remained the same. Sonny Franzese was unforgettable. Historians pointed out that his life mirrored the trajectory of 20th century America. He was born in Europe, raised in an immigrant community, rose through organized crime during its golden age, and lived to see globalization and technology transform the country. He had been present for Prohibition, the Depression, the nightclub boom, the disco years, and the digital era. Few figures, criminal or otherwise, had such a panoramic view of American life. To study Sonny was to study the shifts of an entire century. Family remained part of his legacy as well. His son Michael, who had left the life decades earlier, spoke publicly about both the glamour and the costs of growing up under Sonny's shadow. Michael described his father as both loving and fearsome, a man who demanded respect at home as much as on the streets. Their relationship was complicated, scarred by prison years and different choices. But Michael acknowledged that his father's strength shaped him. In interviews, Michael often emphasized how remarkable it was that his father lived so long without ever breaking the code. Even those who had walked away from the mafia could not ignore the pull of Sonny's example. For the public, Sonny became almost mythical. Photos of him in his final years, thin, aged, yet still sharp-eyed in his tailored suits, circulated online with captions marveling at his endurance. Social media, a world far removed from the nightclubs of mid-century New York, embraced him as a kind of icon. Memes quoted his one-liners, documentaries drew new fans, and his name became shorthand for old-school toughness. Young people who knew little of the mafia learned his story through streaming platforms, and in doing so, they kept his legend alive in an entirely new age. Even law enforcement figures, long his adversaries, admitted grudging respect. Retired FBI agents described how difficult it had been to catch him, how careful he had been with words, how disciplined in his routines. Prosecutors who had faced him in court acknowledged that even in defeat, Sonny never looked broken. They recognized that he was the last of a breed that believed in rules, however harsh, and that his refusal to cooperate set him apart from nearly everyone else who survived that long. In the years since his death, Sonny Franzese's story has become something larger than crime history. It is now woven into the cultural fabric of America, sitting alongside myths of the frontier, tales of prohibition, and the legends of Hollywood. He represents the glamour and the darkness, the resilience and the ruthlessness, the loyalty and the betrayal that define so much of the American story. When people speak of him now, they rarely talk only about his cases or charges. They talk about the image, the sharp suits, the steady voice, the man who seemed untouched by time. They talk about how he walked out of prison at 100 years old, still unbroken. They talk about how he lived to 103, outlasting nearly every enemy and friend alike. In those conversations, he has become something greater than fact. He has become myth, and myths do not die. As the years passed after Sonny Franzese's death, his story only grew more layered. He was no longer just a man remembered by those who had lived in his time. He became a canvas on which people painted their own ideas of what the mafia had once been. Some called him the last gentleman gangster. Others called him a symbol of ruthlessness, disguised in charm. The truth, as always, lived somewhere between. But what no one could deny was that his life had stretched across the entire arc of organized crime in America, from the smoky backrooms of the 1930s to the digital headlines of the 21st century. Writers and filmmakers leaned heavily into his image. He appeared in biographies and documentaries as the archetype of the disciplined mobster, the man who wore suits like armor and spoke with measured words. He was often contrasted with the loud, reckless figures of the same era, the ones who drew too much attention and burned out quickly. Sonny, by comparison, seemed eternal. Even when locked in prison, he carried himself as if he were still walking into the Copacabana on a Saturday night. That composure fascinated people because it spoke to something deeper than crime. It spoke to the human need for self-control in the face of adversity. Younger audiences, who had never known a world where the mafia controlled unions and construction, found in Sonny's story a strange kind of nostalgia. They imagined a time when power was dressed in silk ties, when men spoke softly but commanded entire neighborhoods. They didn't see the fear, the broken lives, the debts that crushed families. They saw the polish, they saw the discipline, and through that lens, Sonny became almost heroic. It was a reminder of how history is often shaped less by facts than by the way stories are told. Historians, however, pressed on the contradictions. They pointed out that Sonny's survival came at the cost of others, that his longevity was not just about discipline, but about the fear he instilled. They examined his trials, the charges of extortion and robbery, the whispers of darker acts. They noted how his refusal to cooperate, while celebrated by some, also meant he carried secrets to the grave. Secrets that might have given families closure. For them, Sonny was not simply a gentleman, but a man who had chosen a code that demanded silence, even when silence inflicted pain. And yet, that silence is what made his legend. He never testified, never traded information for freedom. In an age when informants became common, Sonny stood apart. That choice meant more prison time, more years lost, but it also cemented his image as unbreakable. To mob historians, that made him the purest expression of the old world, the one who clung to rules long after others abandoned them. His endurance, paradoxically, made him both a villain and a figure of respect. Michael Franzese, his son, continued to speak publicly about him. Michael's own journey, from mob life to redemption, added another layer to Sonny's story. He described his father as loving but demanding, a man who carried both tenderness and fear into his family life. Their relationship had been strained, but in Michael's words there was also pride. He often said that his father's strength, his refusal to break, was extraordinary, even if it came with costs that outsiders might never fully understand. Through Michael's testimony, Sonny remained not just a legend of crime, but a human being. Complicated, flawed, yet deeply real. Culturally, Sonny became a shorthand for the idea of the old-school mobster. Whenever a new show or film portrayed a disciplined, sharp-dressed figure who never lost composure, critics would point back to him. He was cited in articles about loyalty, in podcasts about resilience, even in motivational talks about the value of discipline. People found lessons in his life far beyond crime. Some admired his ability to endure. Others saw his story as proof that unchecked ambition leads only to years behind bars. In both cases, his name gave the lesson weight. What made his story so enduring was its completeness. Sonny had lived through everything. The rise of the mafia, its golden years, its collapse, the betrayals, the prison cycles, the betrayals within his own bloodline, and the miracle of walking free at 100 years old. There was no chapter of organized crime that did not touch him. He was not only a participant, but a witness, and by surviving he became the thread that tied it all together. By the late 2020s, articles still appeared about him. True crime enthusiasts revisited his interviews, analyzing each pause, each smile, each carefully chosen word. Academics debated whether his longevity was luck, discipline, or a mix of both. Fans of mafia lore continued to post his photos, often with captions about strength, loyalty, or survival. In death, he had become something greater than in life, a story that could be told and retold, reshaped for each generation. But for those who knew him personally, the legend was always balanced by memory. They remembered the father, the friend, the man who sat at tables and told stories about Brooklyn in the 1930s, the man who smiled at grandchildren, the man who carried himself with quiet pride even when frail. They remembered his charm, his warmth, and the weight he carried. They also remembered the costs, the years of absence, the prisons, the silence. For them, Sonny was not myth, but man, both inspiring and tragic. His story reminds us that history is rarely simple. Sonny Franzese was feared and admired, ruthless and elegant, loyal and scarred by betrayal. He embodied the contradictions of the mafia itself, its codes, its glamour, its violence, its decline. That complexity is why his name has endured, why people still speak of him, why his story continues to fascinate. He was not just the last of his kind. He was the mirror through which we can see the full arc of an entire world. In the end, Sonny Franzese's life was less about crime than it was about survival. He had stepped into the world of organized crime as a young man in the 1930s, when opportunity was scarce for children of immigrants and respect was often earned by power more than pedigree. He moved through decades with the same steady demeanor, never the loudest, never the flashiest, but always commanding attention. He became a figure of both elegance and fear, someone who could charm a celebrity in one breath and enforce a debt in the next. What separated Sonny from so many others was not wealth or violence, but endurance. He survived the government's fiercest prosecutions, survived long prison terms, survived betrayal, and even survived his own body's march toward old age. Where others broke, he remained whole. Where others turned witness to save themselves, he stayed silent even when silence cost him decades. That refusal became his defining trait, the reason his name was remembered long after many of his contemporaries faded from memory. His story is filled with contradictions. He was a loving father who carried himself with warmth at home, yet his choices often tore his family apart. He was a disciplined gentleman who valued loyalty, yet he thrived in a world built on fear and exploitation. He represented the glamour of the old mafia, the suits, the nightclubs, the respect. Yet he also embodied its darkness, the endless cycle of prison sentences and betrayals. He was both admired and condemned, celebrated and mourned, a man impossible to reduce to a single idea. What made his final years so remarkable was that he lived to see himself become a legend. He sat for interviews, answered questions with quiet smiles, and allowed the world to see the sharpness that had carried him through a century. To audiences too young to remember the golden age of the mafia, he became a myth brought to life, proof that the old stories were real. To older generations, he was a reminder of what once was, the last surviving piece of a vanished world. When he walked free at 100 years old, it was as though time itself had surrendered to him. The sight of a centenarian mobster stepping into daylight became a symbol of resilience that reached far beyond organized crime.